Hi, my name is John Kelley. I'm in Holland, Massachusetts. Now, on the other side of this bridge that crosses the Quinnebog River is a place called Curtis Island. It was named after Ephraim Curtis, a man that actually only spent just a few hours on that tract of land. Now, Ephraim Curtis was one of the key negotiators during the King Phillip War of 1675 and 1676 between the Native Americans and the Bay Colony authorities at Boston. Now, the Native Americans had started an uprising. They had had enough. The time had come to drive the never-ending wave of newcomers to the sea. For the colonists, insatiable lust for land was pushing the Native Americans farther inland. Now, we're very fortunate to have a written account of what happened here, July 24th, 1675, by Ephraim Curtis himself. So let's start off with, where is Holland, Massachusetts, and who was Ephraim Curtis? Holland, Mass. It's bounded on the north by Brookfield, on the east by Sturbridge, on the south by Union, Connecticut, and on the west by Wales, Mass. Throughout the years, Holland has remained an example of the charm and beauty of the traditional New England villages. Small town USA. Park your car at the canoe boat ramp. Follow the trail to Curtis Island. It's actually not a true island. It's an area encompassed 4 acres of land surrounded by a miry swamp. And I am standing right here. The very spot where Ephraim Curtis stood in July 1675. So, who was Ephraim Curtis? Ephraim Curtis was a son of Henry Curtis, original grantee of Sudbury. He was of a sturdy, adventuresome nature, a frontiersman, soldier, and scout. The custom of the red man, the resort of the wild game, the campfire, and the night ambuscade were all familiar to him. A short time before the outbreak of King Phillip War, Lieutenant Ephraim Curtis turned his face towards the west and made his camp in what is now Worcester, Massachusetts. He was actually the first white settler that left Sudbury, with a pack on his back, a long, light Spanish gun on his shoulder, an axe in his hand, and set his face towards Worcester, arriving after 2 days' travel on the very spot owned and occupied by his descendants on Lincoln Street. Now, he was all alone in this wilderness for a year or more, and in subsequent times he used to tell how after working all day he would sit down and look towards Sudbury and shed tears in spite of himself. But he had the will that bore him through. For a time, he claimed the whole town of Worcester. Ephraim Curtis had an intimate acquaintance with the country and its native inhabitants. He could speak their language with fluency. One prominent service that he performed was in acting as a messenger of the colonial authorities to the Nipmuc Indians, who inhabited the western and central Massachusetts. And that's what brought Ephraim Curtis to the island that was named after him, Curtis Island in Holland, Massachusetts. In July 1675, Ephraim Curtis, 33 years old, was employed by the Governor and Council of Massachusetts upon service to the Nipmuc country. My journey, my chief endeavor, was to inquire after the notions of the Indians. The first information I had was at Marlborough at the Indian fort. They told me it was very dangerous for me to go into the woods, for that Matunis, which they said was the leader of them, was in company of 50 men of Philip's accomplices, and that it was dangerous to meet or see the other Nipmuc Indians which were gathering together, for they would be ready to shoot me as soon as they saw me. With the news, those 3 Natick Indians, which were with me as volunteers, were discouraged and told me that if I did not provide more company, they were not willing to go with me. I repaired to the constable of Marlborough and to the military officers and told them my business, and they pressed 2 men with horses and arms to go along with me. So in our travels, we followed this tract many miles and found many tents built, whereupon I suppose they might keep their rendezvous for a day or two. And so we found 3 places where they had pitched, but found no Indians. And following still in pursuit of the track, we come to the lead mines by Springfield Old Road. And so, looking out sharp, in about 2 miles riding, we saw 2 Indian, which when we saw, I sent the Indian that went with me from Marlborough to speak with them. Which brings us to Curtis Island. 2 miles riding, we saw 2 Indians, which when we saw, I sent the Indian that went with me from Marlborough to speak with them. But so soon as they discovered us, they ran away from us. But with fast riding and much calling, 2 of our Indians stopped one of them, the other ran away. We asked the Indian where the other Indians were. He, being so surprised with fear, could scarcely speak to us, but only told us that the Indians were a little way from us. Then I sent the Marlborough Indian before us to tell them that the messenger of the Massachusetts governor was coming with peaceable words. But when he came to them, they would not believe him. He therefore came riding back to meet us. These Indians have lately begun to settle themselves upon an island containing about 4 acres of ground, encompassed round with a broad, miry swamp on one side and a muddy river with meadow on both sides of it on the other side. And but with only one place that a horse could possibly pass, and these with a great deal of difficulty by reason of the mire and dirt. Before we come to the river, there met us at least 40 Indians at a little distance from the river. Some with guns upon their shoulders, others with their guns in their hands, ready cocked and primed. As we came near to the river, most of them next to the river presented at us. All my acquaintance would not know me, although I saw near 20 of them together and asked their welfare, knowing that many of them spoke good English. I spake to many of them in the governor's name, which I called my master, the great Sachem of Massachusetts English. I think some of them did believe me, but the most of them would not. There was a very great uproar amongst them. Some of them would have me and my company presently killed. I required their sachems to come over the river, but they refused, saying that I must come over to them. My company were something unwilling, for they thought themselves in very great danger where we were. They said, "What shall we be when we are over the river amongst all that vile rout?" I had told them we had better never have seen them than not to speak with their sachems. And if we run from them in this time of tumult, they would shoot after us and kill some of us. So, with some difficulty, we got over the river and the meadow to the island where they stood to face us, coming out of the mire. Many Indians with the guns presented at us, ready cocked and primed. So we rushed about them and called for their sachem. They presently faced about and went to surround us. Many of them with their guns cocked and primed at us, we rushed between them once or twice and bid them to stand in a body, and I would face them. But still the uproar continued with such noise that the air rang. I required them to lay down their arms, and they commanded us to put down our arms first and come off our horses, which I refused to do. Some of them, which were inclined to believe us or were our friends, some laid down their arms, but the others continued the uproar for a while, and with much threatening and persuasion, at last the uproar ceased. We dismounted and put up our arms, and soon came to speak with the sachems. I had a great deal of speech with them by an interpreter, being brought to their court and sent out 3 or 4 times. Meadowamp, I perceived, was chosen to be the head over the other 5, and was the chief speaker. Their company in number, I judged, maybe near 200 men. Many questions they asked of us, in which we answered. But in the close of all, We told them that if they were not satisfied, Metawamp or Keywood or some of the other principal men would come to the bay. Our great sachem would use them kindly and fill their bellies and answer all their questions. I left them well appeased, and they promised to send an emissary in 3 days' time to the bay to speak with our great chief. The council waited in vain for the embassy. None came, and thoroughly alarmed, they determined to force matters to an issue. Captain Hutchinson and Wheeler, with 20 troopers, along with Ephraim Curtis as the guide, were sent accordingly from Boston July 28th to demand the reasons why the promised embassy had not been sent, and to warn that unless they delivered up Matunis, his accomplices, and all hostile Indians who came among them, the council would hold them as aids and abettors. The expedition returned to the island near the mines in Sturbridge, but the Indians were gone. Turning south, they searched for the Nipmucs as far as Norwich, Connecticut, before turning north to Brookfield. August 1st, the troops arrived at Quabog Plantation. To get a better look at that time period, well, let's go back to that time period. On May 31st, 1660, a land grant was obtained for the area 6 miles squares. The conditions were that they to have 20 family in residence within 3 years, and they have an able minister settle within the term. It was believed that John Warner, John Ayers, William Pritchard, and maybe one other person came to Quabog in the summer of 1660. They were looking to start a new settlement with a convenience of home lots, meadow lots, and planting fields. The most important consideration was the meadows. They were essential for making a hay crop for feeding horses and cattle during the winter months. The Indians would burn the dry grass and brush fields each year, which kept the river and brook meadows clean. In return, the fields were found ready for the plow. Their second consideration was the corn land and rye fields, which they called the plain land. The settlers set apart what was called the Great Fields. This was a tract of land where settlers could have their own portion of tilled land to be worked in common, enclosed by one fence. Location is what is now known as Foster Hill. It was free from woods, except for a few here and there, and had a full view of the meadows and plains. The central building in the village was the meeting house, around which were grouped most of the dwelling houses. The homes of James, Travis, Judah Trumbull, and the Hubbies were a short distance to the east. There are many factors which influenced the establishment of a settlement at Quabog. First, there was a definite need for a midway station for travelers between the established villages along the Connecticut River on the west and those of Marlborough, Lancaster, and the Massachusetts Bay on the east. Second, the influence of John Pynchon promoting such a settlement for his own mercenary reasons. The third, the presence of a group of adventurers from Ipswich who were willing to leave their settled establishments to enter into a new venture with no doubt expectations of economic gain and improvement in their personal estates. Fourth, there was the fertility of the soil, abundance of meadowlands, a good potential village site for home lots, and the availability of water power. And last, the Quabog tribes were receptive to the coming of the planters, at least at first. Here was a settlement planted among the Indian villages, confident of its security because of its decade of peaceful and amicable coexistence with the native neighbors. If the Quabogs had any bad intentions, the planters at Brookfield seemed not to have been aware of them. In spite of the events of the previous few weeks in the other parts of southern New England, Pynchon's planters seem to have placed much reliance on their previous good relationships with the local Indians, reassuring themselves that they were secure from aggression. Little did they realize that Metawamp, co-signer of the deed of purchase of Quabog, pretended friend of the settlers in peacetime, had now achieved a position of eminence in the war cabinet of the Nipmucs. So that was the situation August 1st, 1675, as Captain Wheeler and his troops arrived at the Quabog plantation. Hearing on their arrival at Brookfield that the Indians were 10 miles to the northwest, they sent Curtis with some Indian guides to inform them that they had not come to do them injury, but to deliver a message. Traveling west in the basic route of New Braintree Road, they arrive at the Indian encampment. The natives pronounced it Menamesset. There, Curtis and the native guides were once again treated rudely by the Nipmuc braves, while Metawamp continued his deception and agreed to meet Hutchinson in Brookfield on the following day. They were to rendezvous with the Nipmucs at 8 a.m., about 2 miles from the Quabog plantation, in an open field. However, when the colonists arrived in full force at the agreed spot the next day, they found nothing. At that point, the native guides tried to persuade the English to give up and return to Brookfield, but Hutchinson and Wheeler, however, decided to march on to the Nipmuc camp, where they had met them the previous day. The date is August 2nd. The estimated time, 11 a.m. Hi, I'm here in New Braintree, Massachusetts. Now, the Wheeler surprise in the siege of Brookfield was a battle between the Native Americans against the English of the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the command of Thomas Wheeler and Captain Edward Hutchinson. Now, the battle consisted of an initial ambush by the Nipmucs on Wheeler's unsuspected party at this very spot right here, followed by the attack in Brookfield, Massachusetts. Now, we're very fortunate that Thomas Wheeler had a written account of exactly what happened here. So let's go back in time. August 2nd, 1675.
When we came near the said swamp, the way was so very bad that we could only march in a single file, there being a rocky hill on the right and a thick swamp on the left, in which there were many of those cruel, blood-thirsty heathen who there waylaid us, waiting in an opportunity to cut us off, there being also much brush on the side of the hill where they lay in ambush to surprise us. When we had marched there but 60 or 70 rods, the said perfidious Indians sent out their shot upon us as a shower of hail.
There being, as we suppose, about 200 men or more, we seeing ourselves so beset and not having room to fight, we were in no small danger of being cut off, there being a miry swamp before us, into which we could not enter with our horses to go forwards, and no safety in retreating the way we came, for they had let us pass by them quietly, and when the others shot, they came out and stopped our way back, so that we were forced, as we could, to get up the steep and rocky hill. Myself being gone up part of the hill without any hurt, and perceiving some of my men to have fallen by the enemies, I wheeled upon the Indians. They fired violently out of the swamp and from behind the bushes on the hillside, and wounded me sorely, and shot my horse from under me. My son, Thomas Wheeler, flying with the rest of the company, missed me among them, and, fearing that I was either slain or much endangered, returned toward the swamp again, though he had then received a dangerous wound in the veins when he saw me in danger, whereupon he endeavored to rescue me. Himself therein a loving and dutiful son, he adventured himself into great peril of his life to help me in that distress, there being many of the enemies about me. My son set me upon his own horse, and so escaped a while on foot himself, until he caught a horse whose rider was slain, on which he mounted, and through God's mercy we both escaped. But in this attempt for my deliverance, he received another dangerous wound by their shot in his left arm. There were then slain, to our great grief, 8 men. There were also 5 people wounded: Captain Hutchinson, myself, my son Thomas, and Corporal French, who had killed an Indian, and as he was taking up his gun, shot and part of one of his thumbs was taken off, and also dangerously wounded through the body and near the shoulder was John Waldo of Chelmsford. They also killed 5 of our horses and wounded some more, which soon died after they came to Brookfield. Upon this sudden and unexpected blow given us, we returned towards town and rode as fast as the badness of the way would permit.
So, according to Thomas Wheeler, in order to reach Meadowop's camp, the English had to cross a swamp, taking a narrow path in a single file. Now, this road was not here at the time, and the swamp lined to about here, so they had to go up on the hill a little, single file. Despite the warnings from the Indians that it could be a trap, Hutchinson and Wheeler decided to risk it. After they proceeded for about 400 yards, Meadowop's braves emerged from the hill above and the swamp below and attacked them with bows and rifles. When the English turned around and tried to flee along the narrow path, they encountered another group of Indians blocking their retreat. The colonial forces were completely disorganized. Both Hutchinson and Wheeler seriously wounded. 8 others were killed, 5 wounded. It was a mess.
Let's get back to Captain Thomas Wheeler's narrative, August 1st, 1675. What do we have here? Upon this sudden and unexpected blow given to us, we returned to the town as fast as the badness of the way and the weakness of our wounded men would permit. We being then 10 miles from it. All the while we were going, we durst not stay to staunch the bleeding of our wounded men for fear the enemy should have surprised us again, which they attempted to do and had in all probability done, but that we perceived which way they went, wheeled off to the underhand. And so by God's good providence towards us, they missed us, and we all came readily upon and safely to the town, though none of us knew the way to it, those of the place being slain, as aforesaid, and we avoiding any thick woods and riding in open places to prevent danger by them. Being got to the town, we speedily betook ourselves to one of the largest and strongest houses therein. The news of the Indians' treacherous dealings with us and the loss of so many of our company thereby did so amaze the inhabitants of the town that they, being informed thereof by us, presently left their houses, divers of them carrying very little away with them, and so came to the house we were entered into, very meanly provided of clothing or furniture or provisions. I, perceiving myself to be disenabled for the discharge of the duties of my place by reason of the wound I had received, I appointed Simon Davis of Concord, James Richardson, and John Fisk of Chelmsford to manage the affairs for our safety. Within 2 hours after our coming to the said house, or less, the said Captain Hutchinson and myself posted away Ephraim Curtis of Sudbury and Henry Young of Concord to go to the honored council of Boston to give them the account of the Lord's dealing with us and our present condition. When they came to the further end of the town, they saw the enemy rifling through the houses which the inhabitants had forsaken. As soon as the said post came back to us, the barbarous heathen pressed upon us in the house with great violence, sending in their shot amongst us like hail through the walls, and shouting as if they would have swallowed us up alive. But our God wrought wonderful for us, so that there was what one man wounded within the house. The said Henry Young, who, looking out the garret window that evening, was mortally wounded by a shot, of which wound he died within 2 days after. There was the same day another man slain. A son of Sergeant Pritchard's adventured out of the house wherein we were to his father's house not far from it to fetch more goods out of it, was caught by the cruel enemies as he was coming out towards us, who cut off his head, kicking it around like a football, and then putting it on a pole they set up before the door of his father's house in our sight. The night following the said blow, they did roar against us like so many wild bulls, sending in their shot amongst us till towards the moon rising, which was about 3 of the clock, at which time they attempted to set our house by hay and other combustible matter, which they brought to the corner of the house and set it on fire. Whereupon some of our company were necessitated to expose themselves to very great danger to put it out, began to rage and kindle upon the house side. Running low on ammunition, I spoke to Ephraim Curtis to venture forth again on that service to attempt it on foot. He readily assented and accordingly went out, but there were so many Indians everywhere thereabouts that he could not pass. But towards morning the said Ephraim had adventured forth the third time, and was fain to creep on his hands and knees for some space of ground. But through God's mercy he escaped their hands and headed for Marlborough. The next day, being August 3rd, they continued shooting and shouting and proceeded in their former wickedness, scoffing at our prayers as they were sending in their shot upon all quarters of the house. And many of them went to the town's meeting house, which was within 20 rods of the house in which we were, who, mocking, saying, "Come and pray and sing palms," and in contempt made a hideous noise, somewhat resembling singing. They, carrying more combustible matter, added flax and hay to the side of the house and set it on fire, and then flocked apace toward the door of the house, either to prevent our going forth to quench the fire, as we had done before, or to kill our men in their attempt to go forth, or else to break into the house by the door, whereupon we were forced to break down the wall of the house against the fire to put it out.
I want to pause for a moment in the story to give you a recap of what actually happened in that last day and a half here. Now, I'm standing where the Ayers Inn once stood, the fortified home. Now, it was only 18 by 36 feet. In this small, confined area, there were 50 women, 32 men. That's 82 people in an 18-foot by 36-foot area. We also have 6 wounded and 2 that would die within hours of arriving at the tavern. Their bodies were wrapped and they kept them inside for the next couple of days. Could you imagine the blinding smoke from firing a flintlock black powder rifle indoors? Think about Mrs. Pritchard. Her husband was ambushed and killed at the Wheeler Surprise, and now her son heads to the house right over back over here and is caught by the Indians, his head cut off, kicked around like a football, stuck on a pole right in front of her home. So we're inside the home. The well right here. The well at which Major Wilson was shot 1675. That was the distance from the well. Now the Indians were shooting up on Indian Rock from here. They have the Ayers barn that was once there. And right around that corner is the meeting house. You know what? Let me give you a better idea of what it looked like. Let's start off with a satellite.
Here is a look at the old Quabog plantation today. Let's head down to where the original meeting house was located. Here stood the first and second meeting houses. First burned by Indians August 4th, 1675. Second dedicated October 16th, 1717. Now here's most likely what the meeting house looked like. Well, why would I guess it looked like this? Well, there was a man by the name of Thomas Cooper who worked for John Pynchon of Springfield. He was a man of many talents. One such talent was a surveyor, for he actually surveyed the Quabog plantation in around 1658 and helped purchase the land from the Quabog Indians for John Pynchon. He was also a master carpenter. He built the first meeting house in Springfield, I believe in 1642. Now the Quabog plantation meeting house was built less than 20 years later, and I bet Thomas Cooper had a hand in it. Let's cross the street and head west towards Ayers barn. Right about here. And once again, here's what it most likely looked like. Minus the roof. It would most likely have been thatch. Let's head towards Indian Rock. Indian Rock, 1675. In overlooking Indian Rock, John Ayers' fortified home, the Ayers Inn. Let's take a look at what the home most likely looked like. The roof was thatched with locally available reeds or straw. The interior and exterior walls were made up of daub and wattle, basically clay made up all inside and outside walls of the houses. It was a post and beam frame set on stone pylons. At that time, the average size house was around 18 feet by 18 feet. The Ayers home, being an inn, was 18 by 36, quite large for that time period. Most homes had a garden in the front, fenced in around their well, and a stockyard in the back. And this would be a basic floor plan for that time period. The first floor view and the second floor. Any of you local history buffs must read The Devil's Elbow by Ed Lonergan, and also The Long Journey Home. Fantastic. He did mega research and fantastic books. It's a must read. These are two must reads, and it's all on this subject here. So let's get back to Captain Wheeler's narrative. Ephraim Curtis, it's August 3rd, early in the morning, before the sun rises. Ephraim Curtis ventured for the third time and was fain to creep on his hands and knees for some space of ground that he might not be discovered by the enemy, who waited to prevent our sending if they could have hindered it. Through God's mercy, Ephraim Curtis escaped and walked safely to Marlborough, though very much spent and ready to faint by reason of want of sleep before he went from us, and his sore travel night and day in that hot season. Yet before the said Ephraim got to Marlborough, there was intelligence brought hither of the burning of some houses and killing of some cattle at Quabog by some who were going to Connecticut. But they seeing what was done to the town and hearing several guns shot off further within the town, they durst not proceed any further and immediately returned to Marlborough. Meanwhile, Major Willard was commissioned to look after some Indians to the westward of Lancaster, where he himself lived, and to secure them, and was upon his march towards them on that foresaid Wednesday in the morning. He then being acquainted that it was feared that Brookfield, a small town of about 15 or 16 families, were either destroyed or in great danger thereof. So he altered his course and marched with his company towards us, and came to us about an hour after it was dark as aforesaid. Also on the 3rd of August, going abroad in a yard, one Thomas Wilson of that town, being sent to fetch water for our help in further need, that which we had being spent in putting out the fire, was shot by the enemy in the upper jaw and in the neck, the anguish of which wound was such at the first that he cried out with a great noise, by reason whereof the Indians hearing him rejoiced and triumphed at it. But his wound was healed in a short time. Praised be God. On Wednesday, August the 4th, the Indians fortified themselves at the meeting house and at the barn belonging to our house, which they fortified both at the great doors and at both ends with posts, rails, boards, and hay to save themselves from our shot. They also devised other stratagems to fire our house on that night following. Namely, they took a cart and filled it with flax, hay, and candlewood and other combustible material, and set up planks fastened to the cart to save themselves from the danger of our shot. Hither, the meeting house, and the location of Ayers' barn. They loaded the front or fore end thereof with matter fit for firing, as hay and flax and chips, etc. 2 of these instruments they prepared that they might convey fire to the house, with the more safety to themselves, they standing at such a distance from our shot, whilst they wheeled them to the house. But the Lord, who is a present help in times of trouble, and is pleased to make his people's extremity his opportunity, did gracefully prevent them of effecting what they hoped they should have done by the aforesaid devices, partly by sending a shower of rain in season, whereby the matter preparing, being wet, would not so easily take fire as otherwise would have done, and partly by aid coming to our help, for our danger would have been very great that night, had not the only wise God, blessed forever, been pleased to send us about an hour within the night the worshipful Major Willard with Captain Parker of Groton and 46 more men with 5 Indians to relieve us in this low estate into which we were in. The enemy endeavored to prevent any help from coming to our relief, and therefore sent down sentinels, some nearer and some farther off, the furthest about 2 miles from us, who, if they saw any coming from the bay, they might give notice by an alarm. And there were about 100 of them, who, for the most part, kept at a house some little distance from us, by which, if any help came from the said bay, they must pass, and so they intended, as we conceive, having notice by their sentinels of their approach to waylay them, and if they could, to cut them off before they came to the house where we kept. More probable is that, as we have since had intelligence from some of the Indians themselves, there was a party of them at another place who let them pass by them without the least hurt or opposition, waiting for a blow to be given at the said house, and then thy themselves to fail upon them in the rear, as they intended to have done with us at the swamp, in case we had fled back as before expressed. Back to the Ayers Tavern. Now this is most likely what the town road looked like in 1675, when Major Willard and the militia arrived at the Quabog plantation. Willard and the militia were heading from this area, and right to the left here is Ayers Tavern. They were arriving. Now it was dark. Now this is according to Captain Wheeler's narrative. The major and the company were no sooner at the house and were ready to shoot at us, thinking that we were the enemy, till they discerned that we were the English by the major speaking and the cause of a trumpet. They had a trumpet inside, and somebody played the trumpet. He goes on. But the Indians discerned that there were some come to our assistance, whereupon they spared not their shot, but poured it out upon them. So they're pulling up to this area right here. The little small paddock is to the left here, and they don't know what's going on. It's pitch dark, and they don't know if they're the enemy inside the tavern, and as that's happening, the natives are shooting from behind and up through this area right here. The Indians shooting so at them, we hastened the major and all his company into the house as fast as we could, and their horses into a little yard before the house. Major Williams' men arrive at the inn. 132 people occupying this small area at that time now. We're talking the hot August heat with zero ventilation. The stench of death, bloated bodies and cattle baking in a summer heat for days. There are no outhouses. They're defecating in buckets in front of each other. More wounded men arrive. 2 inhabitants of the town give birth in those last 3 days. Almost total darkness except for a few candles, if they actually thought of bringing candles. The lack of food and water, blinding smoke from firing a black powder weapon indoors. After Major Willard were to come into the house to us, the enemies continued their shooting some considerable time. But when they saw their divers' designs unsuccessful and their hopes therein disappointed, they then burned the meeting house and the barn. The greatest part of them, towards the breaking of the day, August the 5th, went away and left us. And we were quiet from any further molestations by them. That morning, we went forth of the house without danger. By August 6th, reinforcements were now pouring into Brookfield. Beers and Lathrop marched in from the east, and on the same day from Springfield, Thomas Cooper. And Watts from Hartford. We have Captain Mosley from Mendon. By August 9th, there were over 350 men here under Major Willard's command at the Quabog Plantation. Majority of the residents after this returned to Ipswich, while a few headed to Springfield and Hadley. Brookfield was soon abandoned by all. Some months afterwards, travelers spoke of abandoned cattle that had returned to their old home and were grazing among the ruins up on today's Foster Hill. At this very spot, we have cattle grazing 350 some odd years later. I find it pretty amazing that this Foster Hill, this area, is still basically the same as it had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. Thomas Wheeler returned to Marlborough. Captain Hutchinson also returned to Marlborough but died from his wounds 2 weeks later. Ephraim Curtis wasn't out of the woods yet. 6 months later, March 1676, he led the troops that held off the attackers at Marlborough, Mass. Now later in life, Ephraim Curtis returned to his hometown of Sudbury, where he died at the ripe old age of 92 in 1734, leaving 250 acres in Worcester to his son, Ephraim Curtis Jr. Now, before I end this documentary, I think it's very important to get the Native Americans' perspective. This conflict was not a one-sided conflict. Well, let's go back. Now, the 17th century began an era of profound cultural changes for the Native Americans in this area. Over the previous hundreds of years or more, the lives and the culture of the eastern woodland Indians had changed very little. If any changes took place, it would have involved small degrees. As I stated earlier, their environment provided them with all the natural resources required to meet their needs. Now, after the arrival of the Europeans to the shores of North America, the traditional native pattern of living were radically altered. Gradually, the Indians became more dependent on the white settlers, to the point of almost total subservience. Any prolonged contact between two societies with different cultures causes change to occur in both societies. Now, each borrows cultural traits from each other, particularly if the newly acquired trait is better than a traditional one. Initially, the English depended on the Indians and in many instances would probably not be able to survive without their help. The natives provided the newcomers with food in times of shortages and taught them how to hunt and fish and how to live in their new environment. Once the colonists mastered the skills and learned to become more self-sufficient, they no longer needed the Indians' help. Actually, there is one thing left that the colonists still needed from the natives. It was their land. The trading settlements provided a convenient place to barter their corn and pelts for highly coveted English goods. But by the early 1670s, they realized the terrible price they had to pay for these benefits. With the beaver trade dwindling and the wampum replaced by the English coin, the natives were heading for a storm. With no longer a reliable source of income, they quickly became indebted to the traders. And on top of that, there was mounting pressure by the Puritan government for the Indians to abandon their beliefs and accept the white man's God as the one true God. Ancient tribal rituals and customs branded by the Puritans as being morally wrong or anti-Christian were outlawed. The powwows, or the shamans, The traditional holy men and healers, held in high esteem by the Indian people, were prevented by law for practicing their craft. They had to operate underground. Gradually, the natives were being forced to turn away from their ancient ways of life and assimilate. But of course, they were never really fully accepted in the mainstream of the New England's white society. But hold on, there's more. The Puritan government of Massachusetts embarked upon an official course of action to have all the Indians in the colony confined to a specifically designed area, or independent townships, run by the missionaries. These were actually nothing more than reservations. The Native Americans called them praying towns. They were spread out through central Mass. The policy was not unlike apartheid imposed by the government of the Union of South Africa between 1948 and 1991 against the blacks and other non-Caucasians. No longer would the people be able to roam the land as they had done all their lives and countless other generations had done. And the conversion of the growing number of the people to Christianity eroded the stability of the tribe unit from within. A constant state of turmoil and unrest was created by the spread of organized religion. Opposing viewpoints often pitted friends against neighbors and even close relatives against one another. Frequent and often heated arguments between rival fractions within the tribe threatened to disrupt the peace and harmony of what had previously been a close-knit group. And finally, the natives were deliberately and systematically being disposed of their tribal lands to make room for the ever-expanding white population. The Englishmen's greed for land was insatiable. Just prior to the outbreak of the King Phillip War, representatives of the Massachusetts government served the Nipmuc sachems, the Nipmuc chiefs, with official notice that all vacant or unapproved land within the colony's jurisdiction would be taken over for distribution to the prospective settlers. This issue alone was the greatest contributing factor to the problem of mounting racial tension between the Central Mass Indians and the ruling white government. Now let's get this straight here. The official notice was that all vacant land or unapproved land within the colony's jurisdiction would be taken over for distribution. Vacant, unapproved land. Of course, the Massachusetts authorities were aware that the natives were seasonal people and didn't live in permanent villages. So basically, if the natives didn't live like the white people and didn't fence in their yards and live in log homes and have domestic cattle and, well, basically their property was open for settlement. What a sad day for the natives to return to their summer planting fields and find a new colonial outpost, and the helplessness of not being able to do one thing about it. The stage was set. So who was Metacom, or King Phillip? He was born around the time of the Pequot Wars, about 20 years after the arrival of the Pilgrims. He knew no other world but the one in which the English and the Wampanoags lived together. Even his name, Phillip, which was given to him by the Pilgrims, suggests that he was comfortable in the two cultures. He came of age in the late 1650s in a world his forefathers could not even imagine. He fancied fine English lacework and finely detailed wampum. He counted among his close friends both English and Indian, and was often seen walking through the streets of Boston. As he approached manhood, though, Phillip became more aware of his father's unease. Massasoit's tribal borders has receded, and disease has continued to thin the Wampanoags. And his trusted friend, Edward Winslow, has died. And the new leadership at Plymouth had little memory of the time when they were needed. Shortly after Winslow's death, Massasoit passes away in 1661. Well, the following year, Philip's brother, Wansuta, the next sachem, died soon after making a peace treaty with the English. Suspicions were rampant that the English had poisoned him. Tensions between the Wampanoags and the colonies were reaching alarming levels. As the English expanded their settlements to include over 90 towns, the natives were being pushed continuously inland and away from the eastern seaboard. Naturally, the war was a result of a number of accumulative events, but the discovery of John Sassoon's body at the Swampsips Pond would be the prime instigator. The English hanged 3 of Philip's men for the supposed crime, which Philip saw as an affront to his jurisdiction. Philip had had enough. He raided the outpost settlements of Swansea, Massachusetts, and the war was at hand. With each successive raid on English outposts, the Indian Confederacy grew. Well, the time has come. The remaining Indians that were free, so to speak, no longer found it safe to live in their own homelands. So they pulled up stakes, destination north to Canada or west to New York State, never to return. Now, the Indians that resided at the designated praying towns didn't fare as well. Help was not exactly forthcoming. From the very start of the war, enraged colonists began advocating the imprisonment of Eliot's converts, believing that although many Christians, Indians had lived among the English for most, if not all of their lives, they could not be trusted to resist the temptation to join Philip's campaign of terror. Persuaded by this fear, on October 13th, 1675, 5 months into the King Philip's War, the Massachusetts Council ordered that all Christian Indians be rounded up, marched through the countryside, and interned on Deer Island for the duration of the war. An eerie foreshadowing of the fate of the Japanese Americans during World War II. With little food on the island and less shelter, half of the hundreds of Indians confined on Deer Island died of starvation or exposure during the relentless winter of 1675-1676. Also, from the start of the war and for some time afterwards, all Indians believed to be hostile or dangerous, particularly most of the young males, were condemned to be sold into slavery in foreign countries. Now, this practice dated back to the Pequot War and was viewed by the Puritans as a measure of securing the safety of New England society against future trouble by eliminating any potential hostile elements. And many were shipped to the slave markets of Bermuda, the West Indies, Spain, Portugal, and the Mediterranean coast. They came with the Bible and their religion. They stole our land and crushed our spirit, and now tell us we should be thankful to the Lord for being saved. When Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of the New World, he quickly sends a letter to the Queen of Spain regarding the native peoples. The Indians are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who had not witnessed them would even believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Christopher Columbus's letter to the Queen of Spain.